There we go. I'm Catherine, and I've been a statistician in DWP for about 20 years now. And I've only come into the digital performance analytics area in the last few years. I've done a lot of work on admin data and data presentation. I'm currently working on the slides that the Prime Minister presents about coronavirus. So I've got a bit of a dual role at the minute. I'm quite new, as I said, to digital performance analytics, unlike Gemma, who's been doing it for a long time.
I'm Gemma Elsworth. I'm not new to digital performance analytics. I've been doing it for the last decade, but I am new to civil service. So I've only been in the civil service for 2.5 years, which is quite new for civil service terms. I've specialised up until this point in conversion rate optimization, A/B testing, and now I've come into DWP Digital working on the web analytics and the way that we measure success in our services.
Thanks. Okay, today we're going to talk about why measuring success is important, and we're going to be answering these questions, hopefully. Whether we've made things better when we iterate our service, how we decide what to measure to do that, what we do after we've measured it, and then have a think about what would happen if we could measure something before we made the change. And Gemma's going to take us through that bit. Okay, so let's imagine we have a digital service that's meeting some of our users' needs. We might have had feedback from our users that there's something missing, or there might be something in the backlog that we know we want to iterate. And we've done a huge amount of work as a team with the user research. We've done design work, business process impacting. We've done all of the developing and testing, and we've released the new version. But now what? Do we celebrate because our iteration worked? Or do we commiserate and go back to the drawing board because it didn't? Now, if we don't measure something about the iteration, we won't know whether we've hit our goals or not. So we could just be throwing new things at the users without actually knowing whether they're working or not. So in DWP, what we do is, usually during the alpha phase of a new digital service, we'd run a session called a performance framework. And that's to think about, what do we want to measure across the digital service? Because we found that if we ask our stakeholders, what do we want to measure, we'll often get one of two responses. Either we want to measure everything we used to measure, because usually a digital service is replacing something old, or I want to measure everything. And we'd love to measure everything, but we need to be able to prioritize, and we really need to know what's the most important. Where are we going to get the most value out of things? So that's where we usually start. We ask the team about what the goals are, and that means quite a strategic. We get a strategic vision of the service. We think about what would it look like if we succeeded, or if we failed. What would that look like? What are the risks to the service? And only when we've thought about those things do we think about, well, how could we measure that? So it means that we end up with measures that are linked to our goals. We don't just start at the bottom with the stuff that's easy to measure. And it's not, often we find that it's not linked to the current availability of data. We're not sort of stuck with what we've currently got. So these performance frameworks are good for quite a few different things. They stop us being lazy and assuming that the 4 KPIs that GDS tell us to measure will be enough to measure our service, because they won't be. Those 4 KPIs are there as a bare minimum. And I'd like to make a little note of caution here as an aside. Please don't be tempted to try to benchmark your service against a different one. Your digital take-up, for example, is likely to be really different your completion rate might be really different, and it entirely depends on the users of the service. For example, in DWP, we wouldn't want to compare the time it takes for someone to apply for pension credit with the time it takes for someone to report a change to carers allowance, because the type of people who are doing it are really different. Their familiarity with the service, the digital service, is quite different, but also the policy, the detail of the policy is very different. So comparing those things isn't fair. So when you're thinking about your KPIs, the GDS KPIs, don't necessarily compare yourself to other services unless you're sure it's a fair comparison. So yes, that was a warning and aside there. What else are performance frameworks useful for? Well, they're good at helping us talk about those true goals and starting at the top, because if we're brutally honest, sometimes we just have to replace a digital system because the old one's going to fall over. So we may not really have thought through what our goals are for our users. So it can be really good to get those out in the open and talk about them with the team. I saw this on Twitter just this week from Hannah Shank, who is the author of the book Power to the Public, and it's about using government data, using design and delivery to help become faster and better at connecting citizens to the services that they need in the American digital service. And it really spoke to me, because if we only have one goal, that we have to replace the old system with a new one, we'd only need one measure, did we do it or not? But that would be entirely missing the massive opportunity to make things better. So these frameworks allow us to set ourselves those goals if they don't already exist, and let us think about ways of measuring. So we can also iterate performance frameworks. The goals that we have at the beginning of private beta might be quite different to the goals that we've got moving through into public beta and then live. So we should revisit these frameworks and update them. And if you'd like to read more about performance frameworks, search for setting up a performance framework for the UK Parliament website, and you'll find a blog. It's a few years old now, but it's still really relevant and really kind of fits in with the way we do things in DWP. So today we weren't necessarily going to talk about meta measurement, but zoom in a bit on iteration and and making changes. So quite small scale. And the way that we do this in DWP is by thinking about hypotheses and working with the digital team to talk about actually all of these things. So it's a performance framework, but just on a really specific focused change. What are we trying to achieve? What will we see if it does work? What might we see if it doesn't? And that's not necessarily just the opposite of what does success look like. Sometimes we can force almost like perverse incentives, and we need to check that those things aren't happening. And we also try to think, and it's very difficult, but we try to think about how much of a change we're aiming for. That can be quite an academic discussion or a difficult one to answer, but there might be some real numbers that we're trying to hit, and only once that we've got there would we class this as a success. For example, if we think about a change in an iteration of collecting people's personal details, so we might want to increase the completion rate by 10 percentage points, because that might save us 2 hours per day per processor, because we might have to call people back if they don't fill in their personal details completely. So having those real targets help us to set an objective. Otherwise, what we do is say, well, it's changed by 2%. Was that enough? We don't know. So as I said, it can be really difficult to have those conversations and decisions, but it's worth trying at least. So I'm going to talk about a change that we made recently on a DWP service where people can apply for the help of the child maintenance service to set up and maintain financial arrangements between parents. And we ask the applicant whether the child or their children stay at the other parent's house, because we use that as part of the calculation of how much money is due to be paid. We'd had some feedback from parents and also from our operational colleagues that the parents weren't sure how to answer this question if they had a fortnightly arrangement. So at the minute you can see there's a radio button, and then they just had to put in the number of nights that the child stayed with the other parent per fortnight. But there was a user need for splitting that into like week 1 and week 2, because sometimes that's how people have their arrangements. And again, from feedback, we knew that people were often not having a set arrangement. So they would find it quite stressful that they didn't know which of those answers to choose. So we had to think about what we were going to do and went through the same kind of process of our mini performance framework. So I won't necessarily read all of that out for you. We use Google Analytics on the service, and we have a cookies consent mechanism that means that we only collect that data for the people who agree to it being collected. And that's about 80% of the people who use the service. So the data is reliable enough for us to measure this change. We also have, in addition to Google Analytics, management information about the number of phone calls, the number of web chats that we have. We've got, as I said, user feedback from like an end of service survey, and we talk to our agents as well. Okay, so we've thought about what we wanted to change. We've got our benchmark from before. We've made the change. And now we've got our new numbers, and we need to think about, well, what do we do next? So there's the first screen again. And these are the changes that we made. So we added in an interaction. So if somebody chooses fortnightly, they've now got 2 boxes to choose from. Sorry, 2 boxes to put the nights per week in, and also a no set arrangement option. And on the second question, we didn't change anything. So let's have a look at the Google Analytics data. And I'm going to look at the last question first, because that's the one we didn't change. And the good news is that the interaction with this question also didn't change once we iterated the screen. People are answering it in the same way. Before it was 28%, and after it's 30%. But that sounds like it did change. Is it a true change, or was it just variation in the people that we had using the service? So we can use statistical tests on these results so that we can compare our 2 samples, because I took like 2 weeks of data before and 2 weeks after. And even if they're quite small samples, because this service isn't, it's not massively used, we can still do a statistical test to see whether that change from 28% to 30% would have happened by chance, or whether it was because of something we did. And in this case, the results can be treated as the same. So that's good. That means that we haven't changed the way that people are interacting with the second question by changing the first. And that could have happened. That's almost one of those kind of knockout things. You do something to one part and something happens on the other. So that was good. But on the fortnightly interaction, not so much. We have, however, proved that the no set arrangement was a real user need, because after we added that option in, about a quarter of parents are telling us that they don't have a set arrangement. That's really clear user need. We wanted the error rate on the page to get no worse, basically, and I calculated that as just the number of errors divided by the number of page views to get like an average error rate. But that went up from 5% to 8%. That is a change. That is a statistically significant change. So it's not great. It's not really what we wanted. But because we hadn't really thought about, how much do we want this to change by, it is 8% too much? Most most of the errors that are happening now is because people aren't actually choosing one of the options underneath. They're being reminded that they need to. So it's not a bad thing necessarily, is it? And you know, it's this sort of question that's really difficult to answer. And if this error was causing people to leave the service, we would probably want to regress the change and go back. But our exit rate is low, was low, and now is not statistically significantly lower. It's just about the same. So we're not causing people problems and barriers with these errors. So, you know, should we change it back? And then the final kind of piece of the jigsaw is the multiple answer rate, by which I mean, are people answering that question more than once? Are they choosing more than one of the radio buttons? And before we made the change, about 9% of sessions were answering the question more than once, and that's gone up to 14%. And again, that is a significant change. And the most important thing about that change is that people, about half of the people who do change their minds are changing it from fortnightly to something else. And that would indicate that people are confused by the new interaction. Now, that's just an assumption. Google Analytics can't tell us why people are doing things or how they feel at the time. It's just, we can tell us that they are doing that. So, should we regress? You know, that's still a question that we need to answer, really. But if we've been able to see that slight increase in errors and that slight increase in people changing their minds, would we still have released that design into the service? Might we have tried something different before putting it live? So I'm going to hand over to Gemma now, and she can tell us a bit more about making the change before we make the change.
So just a little thing there, sorry, was that a question from, is it Jed, about radio buttons and multiple answers possible? That was literally just related to what you just spoke about.
Okay, let me have a look.
So get it in before you switched over.
So yeah, people could choose one, well, they can only choose one option at a time, but you could choose weekly, then fortnightly, then monthly, then no set arrangement, then back. And you know, people click around, especially when they like open up new things. So if you click on no set arrangement, it opens up a free text box that you can type into if you wish. And that's what we mean by multiple answer rate. So unlike checkboxes, you can only have one ticked on a radio button before you move on. So if people are choosing more than once, it might indicate that they're confused by what the answer should be, what they think we want the answer to be. I hope that answered that question. Is that a good thing? It depends, and a lot. That's the answer to a lot of these things. If we were asking something that's quite complicated, that you may not know the answer to, then no, not necessarily. But I guess this question, because it is how many nights does your child spend with the other parent, you probably know the answer to that question straight away, which means that if you are choosing more than one option, we've probably done something wrong, and where maybe the wording that we're using isn't clear enough. And that's why we didn't want it to get any worse. Yeah, we can't track users like eye movement or anything like that. But yeah, anytime they click, we get that event into Google Analytics, so we can see what they have chosen before they then move on. Yes. So Gemma, I'll hand over to you now.
Yeah. So what Catherine was talking about was we had a change, we had decided which design we wanted to make, and we published that change and collected the data that we needed to analyze whether there had been a difference between before we made the change and after we made the change. And as she showed, there were some aspects of that change that weren't positive, that were going to be hitting on the risk factors that we would have identified in both our hypotheses and our performance framework. And we want to be able to make things as simple as possible for citizens. So when we make a change that makes things slightly more complicated, that increases our multiple answer rate or increases our errors, then we want to be able to be in a position to make a decision about whether that is the right change or not. So I want to talk specifically about how we could be in a better position to make those decisions before we expend all of the development process on creating that new design. Catherine talked about statistical significance and making sure that we have all of the right data and being able to say whether the changes that we could see in the analysis were down to the changes that we'd made on the page or whether they were down to chance. And I'm going to swoop in now and say that even though we do all of that work to ensure that we get a statistical significant result, we still can't be sure that it's not down to some confounding variables that have polluted the water of our analysis. So there's a few issues with the way that we do things at the moment, and I should caveat this by saying that DWP are a little bit behind the curve, and some of you who are here from HMRC or other government departments are already doing this, but I'm going to talk about why I think that we should do it more in DWP. There's some issues with the way that we test at the moment, and one of them is we can only test one idea at once. So we've got the screen that we had before, and we've got the new screen, and we want to know if the new screen is better. And we can, using A/B testing tools, we can show those screens to two people at once. So we could show half of the users one screen, the control, and half of the users the variation. But what if we also had a third idea that we thought might be just as good or better than the variation that we were putting up for test? We could also be in a situation using A/B testing tooling where we could show a third of the users each of the different designs and test all of them at once. In this example, I've suggested that maybe we put that second question on a different page. I've done no user research on this whatsoever. I don't know if that's the right answer. It's just for illustration purposes. But by doing this, we could make a decision about the right change of the ones that we're interested in making all at the same time. The second issue is that the results that we see could be impacted by those confounding variables that I mentioned earlier, other changes that go on and noise that happens around the tests that we're running. We're quite lucky in a lot of the services on DWP that we don't have what you see a lot in the private sector with hugely seasonal spikes. I used to work in the travel industry, and we had a huge spike in the summer and a huge spike in January when people booked all of their holidays. When I'm looking at things like universal credit, I don't see the same thing, but we do still have regular weekly patterns and monthly patterns that we have to take into account. So sometimes we have big spikes on a Monday because that's the day that everybody logs into their universal credit account, for example, or we might have a big spike because Get Your State Pension have just sent out a load of letters. We could also have a change in the data because some government advice has been released and it's caused lots of people to come to the site or to come to that service and act in a different way to the way that they would normally behave. If we test both of those screens at different times, any of these factors could come in and change the way that the users are behaving on the data. But if we are testing those two screens at the same time, all of those factors impact on both of the variations of the test. So they both go through the same the same spikes, the same changes, and it means that we know that the change that we see in our results is actually down to the only thing that was different in those two journeys, which is this page that we've changed. You can see here, and I should say that this is not real data on this slide, I've just made it for illustration purposes, that by running all of the tests at the same time, you can see in real time that we're getting different results for each variation, and we can see all of them together in the same conditions. We'll run each test until we get a statistically significant sample size, but they won't be over 2 distinct date periods. We also always make sure that we run tests over a long enough period of time so that they cover what we would know as the usual bias points. So we'd make sure that they ran over a weekend, or we'd make sure that they covered that spiky Monday, anything that we were expecting to happen in that way. You can see from this data that actually, if we had run this test on one day, the day in the middle, I don't know if you can see my cursor, the day in the middle between 3 and 5, we might have chosen a different winner versus when the test ran for the full period of time. So it's always really important to cover those days. And my final issue is that you have to fully develop the change at the moment and go through a full release cycle to be able to decide whether that change has worked or not. And if you've got more than one change to that page that you want to test, you've got the control time period that you have to analyze, and the first variations time period and the second variations time period. And it makes the time that it takes longer and the impact on our development cycles and development teams larger at the same time. So we incur that full cost of development up front, even when we don't know whether it'll work or not. And this is the point where, realistically, once we've released that change and invested all of that time, how likely is it that we're going to say, actually, we don't like that error rate, so we're going to roll it back? It would take something catastrophic for us to think about undoing all of that development work that we've done. Most A/B testing tools come with a visual editor, which means that lots of simple changes can be made straight on the page in the tool. You can edit in HTML, you can edit in JavaScript. And although the change that Catherine's talking about is slightly more complicated, you could still do it in a visual editor. You could still write some code that would allow that change to happen without you opening up your development space to do all of the work that is necessary. And that way you would only need to put it through a QA and a release, and you wouldn't have to do the full development of all of these changes at once. It means that our changes can be made quickly and that we can fail fast and learn fast from the things that we want to release. But the best thing about this is that if we find that the thing that we thought was going to be the answer to all of the problems isn't the answer and it is going to make things worse, we can stop it with just the click of a button. So this is better for all of the reasons that I've already talked about, but it means that we'd be able to run the old against the new and see the differences at the same time and not have to wait 4, 6, 8 weeks to run various variations against each other. We'd get our results more quickly. We can test small front end changes quickly without the need of full developments. And we can understand the value of the developments before we actually develop them, so we know whether it's worth putting our time into or not. And most importantly, if our hypothesis is null, if it's not going to make the difference that we think it is, we can roll it back with the click of a button. To do a quick recap, we talked about we iterate our services, but we need to know if we're making them better. We need to decide what we want to measure, not just on whether the data is easy to get, but whether it actually meets the goals and the reasons that our service exists. When we've measured it, we need to be able to make decisions with that data and with the things that we're getting out of our analysis. And we need to be able to make that hard choice about whether things should stay live or not. And if we were using the technology available to be able to run these tests before we actually developed them fully, we could make it much easier to make those decisions and to make the right changes for our citizens. Thank you very much for taking the time to come and listen to me and Catherine today. If you want to get in touch with either of us, you can see our Twitter handles on here, or you can drop us an email. Are there any questions?
No, all very quiet on the question front.
Sorry, I put my hand up. I didn't know if you were doing hands or not.
Oh, yeah.
I was just going to ask, so is there a visual editor that we're able to use in DWP? Is that the one that you flashed up that's available to us, or?
Yeah, so the one that I found a GIF of is, I've specifically not used a certain tool for these examples, but the one that there is a GIF of is Google Optimize.
Okay.
We have Google Analytics on lots of the services in DWP, and Google Optimize would be pretty easy to start using. We don't have any contracted tools in DWP at the moment, but it's something that we're working on getting in the future.
Okay, thank you.
Any more questions?
And if you do want to be one of our testers, we're more than happy for you, you to volunteer for that too.
Oh, I don't know about that. Probably break it.
I think that might be it then. Well, thanks very much, Catherine and Gemma, for that session, and thanks everyone for attending. So that's the last of our DigiLeaders Week sessions. They'll all be available on our YouTube channel if you just go and search for DWP Digital. And also, if you're interested in finding out more about what we're doing at DWP Digital, we've got a podcast out, which I think we're on to episode 5 at the moment, and that's available on all of the main podcast places. Again, just search for DWP Digital. So, yeah, thanks very much, everyone. I'll stop this recording now. Thank you.